Welcome everyone to this Bright Talk session, which is brought to you by the Storage Networking Industry Association. The SNIA works to develop storage-related standards and has over 2,500 members from 160 companies. You can learn more about the work done by the SNIA by going to snia.org/technical. During this Bright Talk session, we will be talking about how the SNIA Swordfish standard is engaging with open source, and in particular, giving an overview of several tools that we have been developing to both support the development and acceleration of the adoption of the Swordfish standard. Since these are open source projects, we encourage your use and enhancement of these tools, and we will also provide you information on how to contribute to these and other upcoming projects. My name is Rochelle Olvers. I am a storage management architect at Broadcom, and I have been involved with the SNIA for many years. I'm the chair of the SNIA Scalable Storage Management Technical Work Group, which is where the SNIA Swordfish specification is being developed. And I am also on the board of the SNIA Storage Management Initiative, as well as on the board of the SNIA itself, which are both sponsoring the work on the SNIA Swordfish specification. I'm here today to facilitate this webcast, and I'll be back at the end to cover the Q&A session at the end. Your presenter today for this session is Don Deal. Don is a senior storage standards technologist at NetApp with over 35 years of industry experience working with the storage, networking, server, and management technologies, and he has been involved with the SNIA for many years. He is the co-chair of the SNIA Scalable Storage Management Technical Work Group and is also chair of the SNIA Storage Management Initiative. Now for a few logistics. If you have any questions you'd like to ask during the presentation, just type them into the Bright Talk Ask a Question box. I will be collecting the questions, and we will answer them during a Q&A session following the presentation. We expect to have about 10 or 15 minutes for the Q&A session. If you would like to get a copy of the slides, you can find them as an attachment associated with the Bright Talk session. Those are already posted for you. Also, some of the slides in the presentation have quite a bit of detail, so you might find it useful to expand your view to full screen by clicking on the expand icon near the lower right-hand corner of the display. All right, with no further ado, I will now turn things over to Don for the presentation. Don?
Thank you, Rochelle. Again, my name is Don Deal. I'm with NetApp, but I also have roles in the SNIA that Rochelle's already gone over. And what I want to go over today are 4 open source projects that the SNIA has out on GitHub. We'll be talking about each of those briefly, and then I'll be providing some information about where you can go get more to know about Swordfish and Redfish, and also a note about contributing to SNIA open source projects. Now, let's see, we'll go here. And again, these projects were all developed underneath the storage management, the Scalable Storage Management Technical Work Group, or the SSMTWG. And you can get more information about them at snia.org/swordfish. This work was initially funded by the Storage Management Initiative, and that was to get them started. There's plenty more to do on each of these projects. We know that. We invite more people to contribute and help make them better. There is an assumption in this presentation that, some knowledge about Redfish and Swordfish. If you need to know more, I will provide more links later in the presentation about where to go get that additional information. There are currently 4 projects that we'll be going over today. More open source projects are actually coming. We'll be talking about those in the near future. The first of the projects we'll review today is the Swordfish API Emulator. And this is a chunk of software that allows a system to behave like a Swordfish system with stored services in it. and it's something that's useful if you're, in our case, developing the spec, you wanted to try some things before you made it part of the standard, or if you're developing your own implementation of a Swordfish system, this would be something you could use to mock up what you're actually going to build. Essentially, it responds to all the RESTful operations you'd expect, post, get, patch, delete, and what it really does is, what the Swordfish API Emulator does is it does a seamless extension of the Redfish interface emulator. And when you install this, you literally drop, first you install the Redfish interface emulator, and then you install the Swordfish API emulator parts directly on top of the Redfish interface emulator, and they mate. And all this part does is it adds the code for all the Swordfish resources. You can find it on GitHub, github.com/SNIA. You will find all of these projects. This one is the Swordfish-API-Emulator project. There's a complete set of documentation here. It includes installation, user, and developer documentation. We just did a pass to do a cleanup on all this documentation, and it should be very straightforward and easy to understand. Now, one of the things to know about the emulator is that it can act as a live system where everything is what we call dynamic. Dynamic resources in the emulator respond to all of these RESTful commands. It can also have some parts of it running in what are called static resources. Static resources are read-only. In other words, they'll respond to get, but they will not do things for post or patch. But if you're developing an overall emulator of a system you intend to implement, this is useful because it means some parts can be dynamic and some parts of the emulator can be static. And what that means is you don't have to create your entire emulation of your target system at the same time. You can bring it up part by part. In other words, some things can be dynamic at first, and then as you add code to make more things dynamic, you get rid of the static pieces, and after you've done going through a sweep like that, you have an emulation of the living system you want to build. Okay, then, oh yeah, and I do want to emphasize you should really review the documentation if you're going to work with the emulator. And in addition, you want to review the Redfish Interface Emulator documentation as well. Reason for that is that the Redfish Interface Emulator documentation covers the basic configuration stuff for the overall emulator. The Swordfish documentation is primarily going to be focused on the additional storage management parts. So when you run the API emulator on a Windows system, other systems are going to be very similar to this, but when you crank it up on a Windows system, this is the console output when you run the emulator in the default configuration. And the reason I'm emphasizing default configuration is it has a default configuration that includes several CPUs, several chassis, and storage systems and storage services built into it. And the reason for that is when you first fire it up, you're trying to get used to the emulator, and we wanted to make sure that you'd have something to work with. Now, as you want to change the emulator to be your own, that you can reconfigure the emulator to turn off all the pre-configured stuff. And in fact, you can even fire up the emulator running empty, literally empty. And that means you need to find a way to put your stuff in it. Well, there are multiple ways to do that. You can add static resources to it, or you can use regular post operations to jam in the resources that you want in your version of the emulator. And again, the emulator is very flexible about what it will support and when. It doesn't do very much checking on the code that you're putting in by post right now. That's a piece of work that a contributor could, improve it with, but right now it will behave exactly like the system you're trying to build if you use it in the way I'm talking about. Let's see. And again, I do suggest carefully reading the documentation before you go too far with it. Now, once you have the emulator running, again in the default configuration, you can use an ordinary browser to access it, to see that it's alive and doing the right stuff. Now, what I'm showing here are, I took a screen apart into two pieces. So what you see here on the left is that I've used a regular Chrome browser to access the running emulator and port 5000. Port 5000 is the default port you use to talk to it. And I'm accessing /redfish/v1/. That is the Redfish service route. And you'll see this kind of output on your browser. And the things to focus on to tell you that this is in fact the Swordfish API Emulator is that on the upper right, there's storage services showing as a resource, and there's storage systems showing as another resource. Again, Swordfish is a seamless extension of Redfish, and this is the Redfish service route with those new resources added to it. Okay, so part of what I'm showing here is that once you've got the emulator running, you can access it with a simple browser situation. That's not a problem. And any Redfish or Swordfish client should be able to access it just like this. And speaking of clients, that'll get us to the next open source project I want to talk about, which is the Swordfish Basic Web Client. Now, what this is a web-based client that can connect to multiple Redfish or Swordfish services at the same time. And it presents the entire Redfish or Swordfish hierarchy in a browser web frame. And what this code really does is it runs on a system as a server, and it accepts client browser connections. In other words, using your browser, you log into it. And once you've done that, you can then ask it to connect to a Redfish service or a Swordfish service. And you can do that multiple times. So, one interface and you can talk to multiple services. Another thing that's useful here is it is kind of like a really basic it has a really basic peek and poke capability for implementations. And what that means is that you can prowl around in the hierarchy of resources in a given Redfish or Swordfish service. And you can also update properties in those resources as long as they are defined as writable in the schema. There's a link here for where to go on GitHub to get to the basic web client. And again, there's a complete suite of documentation here. The installation documentation is pretty good. As I've suggested with the emulator, you really want to read through the documentation before you just go do it. And that's just to make sure you won't trip over anything in particular. It makes it a lot easier later. Okay, then I'll go to the next thing here. Remember, I said that your browser, you log into the basic web client because it's really a service running on a system. Once you've done that, you then want to ask it to connect to particular Redfish or Swordfish services. The way you do that is on the leftmost panel that's showing here underneath the rather flattened looking Swordfish, there's an add button. You click on that and it will pop out this panel that you see here on the right that says add Swordfish service at the top. You have to give it an IP address and a port number where the implementation is living. Now, what I did here was I'm running a Swordfish API emulator on the same host, so the address it goes to is localhost:5000. Domain name you simply set to a user convenient name here because it's really just a way to identify which service you're hooked to. Username and password, you should enter something there, but they're really not checked at this point. Again, this is code wanting more contribution. You click Add, and what you get after that is the leftmost panel here. It says SAE, I think it's 180828. That is a acronym and a date I used when I wrote that particular version of the emulator. If you click on that, it will pop out the panel you see on the right, where it says Explore the Resources. And if you look at what's listed here, it's exactly the same sort of same list of resources that I showed for the browser output on the emulator, because this is the same emulator. It's just a much more convenient way to go look at it. If you want to look at any of these resources, you just click on them. The next one that I'm looking at here on this example is storage services, which is roughly in the middle there. If you click on that, it will pop out another panel, which brings up the basic behavior in the basic web client is it pops out these panels when you click on a given resource. In this particular storage services, there are 3. There's one called 1, there's one called 2, and there's a third one called AFF-1. Now, at this level, there are no writable no writable properties in the storage services resource. But if there were, if you see this pencil that's on the to the right of the word properties in the properties box, you can click on the pencil, and that will allow you to edit any of the writable properties in that are being viewed by this panel. Again, in storage services, there are no properties that are writable, but I wanted to at least point out the silly pencil icon is, that's how you would do it. The recirculate icon just to the right of the pencil is just a refresh of the view of those resources. Anyway, so that's kind of a basic overview of how the basic web client works. It'll pop out panels to the right. When there are editable properties, you can change them, and it allows you to go through things. Now, just to re-hit one point, way over on the left panel here, where you can hit add more than once, and you can have multiple services connected to the basic web client at the same time. That turns out to be interesting if you're working with multiple services, or in my case, just multiple copies of an emulator, where I'm trying to see how they're different and what happened. Okay, moving on. We have 2 sample integrations one is for Datadog and one is for Microsoft's Power BI tool. Now, the Datadog sample dashboard integration here is meant to tie into the Datadog service, which is really good at giving you a trending view of data. The data that the sample integration lets you look at are the storage system capacity information and the available storage capacity thresholds for a given Swordfish implementation. The way the sample integration works itself is there's Datadog, and this is a plugin, and that plugin knows how to connect to a particular Swordfish service and then provide the information you've set it up for. Again, I want to stress, this is a sample plugin implementation. You would really use it as a starting point for your own customized Datadog plugin. As with our other projects, it's got a complete set of installation, user, and developer documentation. Anyway, okay, this is an admittedly light colored figure that's difficult to see, but the main thing I want to put it up and show is that this is what the output would look like. The lines that are showing on the different panels here are all flat. The reason they're flat was that on this particular run, it was monitoring an emulator where the data was not moving. So yes, Datadog shows you trending data over time, but if the data is not moving, guess what? You get flat lines. So the main thing here is to show that there is a Datadog sample integration that could make it easier if you want to fit in storage Swordfish systems into your storage monitoring situation. And we also have the same kind of plugin as a sample integration for Microsoft's Power BI. Power BI is different from Datadog. It doesn't show a trending view of data over time. It shows the way the data is right now. So it's a point-in-time view of for monitoring systems in a data center. Again, it's the same kind of thing. It's a plugin. It goes in Power BI, and it knows how to log into a Swordfish service and then provide storage system capacity information and the available storage capacity thresholds. We chose those two things as probably being the most interesting to know about a storage service. It could have been a number of other things. Again, this is a starting point for customizing your own Power BI plugin. Let's see, on Power BI, there are two kinds of displays you have with it. On Datadog, it was just the data trending information. On Power BI, it's a little bit different because it's point in time. You have a top level dashboard view, and you have child views where if you want to dive into more detail. The top level dashboard for Power BI, on what we're showing here, this was monitoring a situation where there were 4 storage services, and across those 4 storage services, there were 9 storage pools. And you're getting stats here about each of the different storage pools. If you want more detail about anything, there's a set of links up at the top right, and we'll take a look at, I believe it's storage system 1, where you can go down, by clicking those links, you can go down to a child dashboard, and the child dashboard gives you more information about that particular service. And in this case, there are 5 volumes and a couple of storage pools that volumes can be created from. Anyway, so that should, both the Datadog and Power BI plugins are meant to give somebody a leg up on being able to monitor a Swordfish situation sooner than later. And earlier in the talk, I promised to provide links for more information about Swordfish and Redfish. If you're interested in learning more about Swordfish, then highly recommend going to SNIA.org/swordfish. This is where you can find all kinds of information that's publicly available. We collected it onto a single page, so it's easily accessible. And you get spec schema, mock-ups, user's guide, etc. Similarly, for Redfish, there's at DMTF.org/redfish, you will find a similar set of information. Redfish has been around longer than Swordfish, so there's actually a pile of information there. And also, for developers, I would recommend going to redfish.dmtf.org. That gives you underneath the hood information for Redfish. And again, I can't emphasize enough, Swordfish is a seamless extension of Redfish. So you need the Redfish part and you put the Swordfish stuff in if you're managing storage, in particular enterprise class storage. And if you have questions about anything having to do with Swordfish and Redfish, you can go to redfishforum.com or swordfishforum.com. It takes you to a site that's actually monitored by experts from both the DMTF and the SNIA. And you can get answers to almost anything there about these two specifications and how things should be and what to do if you run into ambiguities in the specs, things like that. Open source projects at SNIA, we very much welcome input. If you download this presentation, there's a live link here, SNIA Open Source Projects. Where that goes is simply github.com/SNIA. Right now, you'll find these 4 open source projects there and more. If you check it in a couple of days, I think there will be a couple of new projects out there. The one thing we ask is if you're going to be a contributor, we do ask you to sign, to agree to the terms of a SNIA contributor license agreement. That's at this link, snia.org/CLA. It's not particularly strenuous. Take a look. It's pretty friendly terms. And the projects that I've talked about here are all covered by the BSD 3-clause license. So, and that gets me to pretty much the end of what I wanted to cover to give an introduction to the 4 current open source projects. And in general, I want to say thank you. And I think I'll hand it back to Rochelle now for handling any questions that might have come up.
Thanks, Don. That was a great overview. We do have a few questions teed up, and I will remind folks that to submit more questions, just type them into the BrightTalk Ask a Question box. We do have about 17 minutes left to answer questions, so please feel free to submit some additional questions. Our first question, what other information will you be providing about getting started with these tools?
What other information? I'm not completely clear on the question.
Right. Okay, so let me help out with this one. One of the things we will be doing, and we have some information coming out fairly shortly with this, is we will be providing some short videos on our YouTube channel that go into a little bit more detail of how to get started with each of the tools. The first one that should be coming out within just a few weeks is how do I install and get started with the Swordfish emulator.
Okay.
All right. Let's see. Next tool. Do you know of anyone using the tools to date?
If you go to the emulator, has been attracting a lot of questions recently, and there's even a current thread going on. Someone who is trying to get started using it. I don't know who they're from. I have definitely been using. I'm with NetApp, and I know that the original emulator came from Intel, the original contribution to the DMTF. So there's a list of companies that have definitely been using it. I guess we could look at the project itself and see if we can identify which companies.
Okay, there's also another project that's available, and I will look up the link and post it, where we have a project that's actually been funded by the NSF. It's called the Compute Non-Autonomic, I've got it's CACC, and I just mangled what the acronym stands for. But a group out of Texas Tech has been working on it as a university research project. They have actually built, and this is really cool, they've actually built a scale-out simulated, I guess emulated since it's an emulator, a scale-out emulated data center. So you can actually stand up in Docker containers a emulated large-scale data center pretty much almost instantly. And they've not only made this available, and it's also available in open source, which is awesome. They've made that available with a UI-driven frame on it, so that it's really, really simple to configure, use, and modify. That's something that's also feeding into other projects that some of our other partners are using, also in the open source space, like the Open SDS community. Okay, next question. What other open source tools are available for Swordfish?
Okay. I've mentioned that a couple of new projects are coming. They're not in place yet, but SNIA will definitely be coming out with additional open source projects. However, a lot of the underpinnings of Swordfish, of course, is Redfish. If you go to github.com/DMTF, you'll find a very rich list of, a very lengthy list of open source projects there. And those, in addition to the Redfish Interface Emulator, it includes a test framework, validation of schema and mockups. There's also a mockup server. There are a number of tools there that anyone who's beginning to implement Redfish and Swordfish would find useful. So that would be the first place I would go. It's github.com/DMTF. And take a look at redfish.dmtf.com as well. That's the developer page for Redfish.
Yeah, and also take a look at the GitHub site, github.com/DMTF, and you'll see directly all of their open source tools. All of those work directly for Swordfish as well.
Yes.
Okay, let's see, next question. I think this builds on what we were just talking about a couple minutes ago. Is there a tutorial video about how to run the Swordfish emulator, both server and client?
I have just reviewed a video that we will put up soon about how to set up and run the emulator. So that's definitely coming, and I believe a little bit farther down the road is the Basic Web Client, the Swordfish Basic Web Client will have a similar video coming out as well.
Okay.
And those are posted under, I believe, the Swordfish School on YouTube, or they will be.
Yes, so that's another thing that you can find if you go to the SNIA.org/swordfish page, or go to our YouTube channel, the SNIA YouTube channel, and look for the Swordfish School videos. Let's see. All right, this is a question looking for, I'm trying to put this in the form of a question. Someone that would just like to know more about what the back-end work is happening. And the question is actually looking for what are we doing of a what, if any, work we are doing of a corollary for Redfish service. I'm extrapolating from what the actual question is here, folks. The actual question is, are we developing any Redfish service frameworks similarly to how WebMSim is being developed?
Okay. Well, the Swordfish work builds on what the Redfish work has done, and SNIA and DMTF are actually have a pretty tight collaboration going on for that work. So where, you know, when SNIA was defining SMI or SMIS, they were using WebMSim, which came from DMTF. This is a little different in that Swordfish is purposely a seamless extension of Redfish. So of necessity, the two groups have been working pretty closely. So if you're looking for information about where to learn more about what or how to participate, perhaps, then the DMTF and the Redfish forum is where Redfish is being developed, and SNIA, the SSM TWG, the Scalable Storage Management Technical Work Group, is where the Swordfish work is happening. I don't know if that directly answers the question, but hopefully it comes close.
And I'm putting in the notes below because I can't figure out how to add another attachment during the presentation. The link to the Scale Out Data Center GitHub project.
Yeah, that is very cool. The Texas Tech has demonstrated it to us a couple of times, and it's just, you can see hundreds of machines running in a simulated data center. It's great.
Okay, so the message just popped up at the bottom of your screen. Sorry, I can't put that in the attachments right now. Okay, so next question. How many vendors are supporting Swordfish?
Okay, now they're publicly announced. I think it's like 2 or 3. Not announced, we think it's more, but we don't know, and if we did, we wouldn't really be able to say. And it's up to each vendor to publicly announce what they're doing themselves, not for us. The publicly announced ones, there's I believe X10, EXTEN is one company that has announced it. And Rochelle, could you help here?
Sure. We have 4 vendors that have public announcements around Swordfish implementations. We have X10. Intel's RecScale design architecture has a reference implementation as well on both client and service side. We also have an SDS implementation announced from a company called Linbit. And the 4th one, let's see, I missed one. X10, Intel, Linbit, and who did I miss?
Starwind.
Oh yes, Starwind. Sorry, Starwind has a client integration. They're largely a Windows integrator. And so they have all been working on different aspects of working with Swordfish. And then, of course, OpenSDS has both northbound and southbound Swordfish work in the open source space. So those are a lot of the public, and as Dawn said, you'll also see a lot of vendors. You know, we have a lot of vendors working within the Swordfish community on unannounced Swordfish work. So there's a lot of activity, not a lot announced yet, but there's a lot of activity. And as you note, as I noted there, we have a lot of work in the SDS space because they see a lot of advantages in the service-based. Swordfish is a service-based model, and so there's a lot of benefits that we're seeing those first adoptions in that space. And then the NVMe over Fabrics X10, first out, was actually in that emerging market space as well. And so I want to actually jump into one of these next questions here because I think the question is it a complete alternative to SMI, and if yes, what is the advantage? The answers to those are yes, but it's actually what we're doing is Swordfish is it's Rust-based. It's much more scalable, and as we look at different markets, as we look at where things are transitioning forward, we see a lot of advantages over SMIS for these different markets. And so when you see hyper-converged and hyperscale, it makes a lot more sense for a Swordfish implementation, particularly if you're looking at the comparison to go into those markets. For existing implementations, it's a little bit tougher choice, but we also are starting to see clients moving in this direction for a lot of these types of configurations. So I'll stop there, and Don, let you pick up and see what else you want to add to that.
No, it's SMIS is out there. It's been in place for a number of years, and it's useful. But it does have issues when it comes to scaling to large situations where if you can have a single client and it can talk to a lot of implementations, but when it starts to be too many, the scaling issues begin to cut in. This is part of what's going on with Swordfish is that it's fitting into a world that is much more scalable in general. It is using, Rochelle has already pointed most of this out, is that it's based on RESTful communications rather than what SNIA was based on, which is SIM-XML. Nothing wrong with it, it worked, it's such, but it's not what's being used in the major cloud environments these days. Those are the main things. It's not that SNIA stopped working or isn't good for what it was meant for. This is meant for larger environments which are targeted toward a world which is to support what are called composed systems. This is where you have racks of CPUs, and you have racks of storage, and a way to interconnect them with fabrics. And you can do on-demand provisioning for workloads using Redfish plus Swordfish. In fact, one of the things that needs to be pointed out is that if you're using Redfish and Swordfish, then with a single basic protocol defined by the Redfish folks, you're able to manage servers, storage, and fabrics. And the idea with a composed system is that you can compose a system to handle a given workload. When the workload is done, you return all the resources, all the processors and the storage back to the pools they came from. In the case of the storage, you probably want to remember what it was, so you can recall it again, because that's what storage is about. But the whole idea is that this is building toward a world where composed systems dominate what people use in large data centers.
Yeah, and so in addition to kind of highlighting about, those market segments that we've just said, we see a lot of storage shifting to those environments. Those environments didn't exist when we defined SNIA. We're not neglecting the existing markets, but we recognize there's been a shift there. So it's not that Swordfish is targeting exclusively those. What we're trying to do is come up with a standard that hits all those market segments, but hits these new market segments extremely well. So when we're talking about what can I put a single API, a single management API on storage products that is able to target multiple market segments and work seamlessly with storage and networking and servers. That's where Swordfish is going to be successful. So that's what we've been trying to build into the Redfish and Swordfish ecosystem. All right. We have about 2 minutes left, and then the system's going to shut off on us. One more question here: is there any work on the roadmap that allows easier testing for sets of requests that Swordfish integrators would use to produce specific changes to a Swordfish implementation? For example, provisioning of volume. One of the things, well, before I jump in and answer that, Don, I would direct folks towards the user's guide, but I'll let you take a shot first.
Yes. Okay. We do have a thing we call the user's guide. You can access it by going to SNIA.org/swordfish and just scan down, and you'll find a reference to a thing called user's guide, and that provides answers to a whole bunch of different situations, including this one, I believe. This one also begins to kind of border on an area we're starting to look at in earnest, which is how do we do conformance testing. But feel free to jump in with more information about that or the basic question, Rochelle.
All right. So there's two things. First of all is we've hopefully developed the API with user use cases in mind. So that's why we have the user's guide out there in parallel. So this basically talks about explicitly how you do these actions, and so that should one of our goals is to basically work on making every implementation as consistent as possible, returning common status codes, returning common error states, returning common, everything very, very common and consistent. So when you provision a volume, it looks the same regardless of which implementation you're talking to. So the user's guide starts you through that. The next thing we're doing is working on starting the development of a conformance test program. So not just do you do these, we hope to get to the point where it's not just do you support this functionality, but also are you conforming to the spec where it says when you do this functionality, you return status in this specific way. And so all of those things are, some of those things exist, some of those things are on the roadmap, but those are all the things we're trying to do to make it both easier to implement and easier to test, because we're putting those guidelines together and that test infrastructure together. And with that, I think we just ticked over our time. I'm not sure how long the system's going to give us before it kicks us out, but with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and thank everyone for joining this Bright Talk session, and we hope you now have a better understanding both of what the Swordfish tool ecosystem looks like and some of the new things that are coming along. Remember, you can easily find more information about Swordfish at SNIA.org/swordfish and the open source tools at github.com/SNIA. Please take the time to rate this Bright Talk session. We hope you found it interesting and useful, and we thank you in advance for your positive reviews and comments. Remember to watch for more sessions about Swordfish in the near future. Thank you.